They claimed the Deathworlder title. Then they discovered Earth. My claws were locked around a support strut 900 feet above a lava field when the proximity alarm screamed inside my skull. I did not look down. Looking down was how new recruits died. I looked up, found the next strut, and threw myself toward it as the thing chasing me cleared the ridge below. It was a vent crawler, the size of a transport shuttle, all heat-sensing eyes and grinding mandibles, and it had been following our patrol for 2 days without showing itself once. Smart animal, patient animal, the kind of animal that makes you understand why Sankara only lets you call yourself an adult after you have survived 3 molting trials, and why even then, half of us do not survive the 4th year of service. The strut held. My fingers did not. I felt the joint pop in my left hand as I caught the edge, and I did not have time to feel anything else, because the vent crawler's head came up through the gap in the scaffolding like a fist through wet paper. "Isek!" Oren's voice cracked through my comm. "Drop the line. I have a shot. Take it." He took it. The round caught the vent crawler under the jaw, and the whole structure shook with the force of its fall, 200 meters down into the lava field. Gone before it finished screaming. I hung there for 1 long second, 4 fingers and a dislocated thumb keeping me from joining it. And then I hauled myself up onto the platform and lay on my back, staring at the orange sky of my own homeworld, breathing. This is what it means to be Deathworlder ranked. Not a medal, not a parade. A standing agreement between you and a planet that wants you dead, where the planet keeps almost winning, and you keep almost not letting it. I earned the rank the way every Vrokash earns it, through 3 molting trials spread across 3 years, each one designed by people who had clearly never liked children very much. The first trial took a piece of my hearing on one side. The second took a name I do not say out loud anymore, not because I forgot it, but because some doors stay shut on purpose. The third took the smallest finger on my right hand, which the medics offered to regrow for a fee I never bothered paying, because by then I had decided the gap was useful. It reminded my hand what it had cost to still be attached to my arm. Nobody explains that part to outsiders. They hear Deathworlder and picture armor and trophies. What it actually means is that you have been counted, formally, by your own people, as someone who survived a world built to erase you, and that the counting left marks. We do not talk about the marks, we catalog them instead, quietly, the way I cataloged the half-second where my fingers nearly let go of that strut, and file them somewhere we can find again if we ever need the reminder. "You're bleeding," Oren said, crouching over me. He had a face built for bad news, all sharp angles and no patience for softening them. "I'm aware. Your hand's wrong. I'm aware of that too." He laughed, short and rough, the kind of laugh you only get from someone who watched you nearly die and is still deciding how to feel about it. Behind him, Cam was already calling it in, flat voice, routine words, like watching a crewmate dangle off a 600-foot drop was simply Tuesday. On Sankara, it was. We were 3 days from the end of that patrol rotation, 3 days from a long stretch of nothing but data review and equipment maintenance aboard the Ninth Tooth, when the priority signal came through and rerouted all of it. I did not think much of it at first. Priority signals came through constantly. Most of them were nothing. A sensor drone losing contact with its relay, a trade route flagged for piracy, the kind of administrative noise that filled half our duty cycles. I was in the medical bay getting my thumb set back into its socket when Vask, our commanding officer, leaned through the doorway with the particular look he wore when he was about to ruin someone's week. "Cathern, you're cleared for light duty in 6 hours. Good, we're moving." "Moving where?" "Sector designation 41. There's an anomaly. There's always an anomaly. This one tripped 3 separate long-range arrays before anyone noticed the signal was coming from inside a system that's not even on the active watch list." He tapped the side of his head, which was his way of telling you to actually listen. "Class 9. Borderline pre-industrial, last survey says. Should be empty noise. Equipment glitch, maybe. But command wants eyes on it before they write it off. And we're the closest hull with a full surveillance suite that isn't already committed. So we're doing a sensor sweep of a backwater that probably has a faulty satellite." "Probably," Vask agreed. "Which is why I'm sending the unit that just had its hand nearly torn off by a vent crawler instead of a fresh team. Don't argue with me, Cathern. The schedule's already filed." That was the thing about being Deathworlder ranked. People assumed it meant they sent you toward the interesting missions. Mostly it meant they sent you toward the boring ones, on the theory that if anything boring ever turned out not to be boring, you were the kind of crew built to survive the surprise. I did not argue. I never argued with Vask when his jaw was set like that. I went back to the medical bay, let the bone setter finish its work on my thumb, and spent the long transit sleeping in shifts and reviewing my own performance logs from the vent crawler incident. because that was also part of the job. You do not get to almost die and then simply move on. You catalog it. You ask what you would do differently. You feed it back into the part of your brain that keeps you alive the next time. 3 days later, the 9th tooth dropped out of transit at the edge of an unremarkable yellow star system, and I was back on duty, half strapped into the surveillance station, running the standard intake protocol on a world that the database file simply called, in flat administrative font, by a single short word. Earth. I remember thinking it was an ugly name for a planet. Most species at least try for something with a little weight to it, a god's name, a word that means home or mother or sky in some ancient dialect. This one sounded like the kind of word you'd use for dirt, for the stuff under your boots. I made a note of that, mostly out of habit, because small details like that sometimes matter later and sometimes do not, and you never know which until you need them. The preliminary scan came back exactly as boring as Vask had promised. A single inhabited world, third from its star, water-heavy, oxygen-rich, gravity close enough to baseline that it would not even register as a hazard on any threat assessment chart that mattered. Population numbers in the billions, which was unremarkable. Technology level pre-orbital, mostly, with scattered low-altitude craft and radio noise bleeding out into the dark in every direction. Decades of it, layered on top of itself like sediment. A talkative species. A young one. The kind of world the Coalition cataloged and then mostly forgot about. The way you forget about a door you have already decided not to open. Anything? Vask asked, from the command chair behind me, not turning around. Nothing that explains 3 arrays flagging it. I ran the diagnostic again, expecting the same null result. Could be exactly what you said. Equipment fault. Solar interference reading as a structured signal. Keep looking. I kept looking. That was the job. You do not get to be the crew sent toward the boring assignments without also being the crew that actually finishes them, instead of writing nothing found across the top of a report and going back to sleep. So I widened the intake window, pulled raw sensor telemetry instead of the clean summary, and let it run while I reset the focus array on the long-range optical feed. Because if there was nothing wrong with the planet, there was at least a chance something was wrong with how we were looking at it. The feed steadied. The image resolved. A storm. A vast, slow, churning storm system. The kind that on most worlds I had surveyed would have already cleared every living thing out of its path for 100 kilometers. The kind of storm that registered on our threat board the same shade of warning orange as the vent crawler that had nearly taken my hand off 3 days earlier. Wind speeds climbing past the point where our own atmospheric shuttles would have grounded themselves. Water rising along a coastline in a way the system's models flagged as catastrophic for any structure built within 2 kilometers of it. And inside it, moving against the wind instead of away from it, a single small shape that the system's automatic tagging routine flagged, hesitated over, and then, because it had no other category that fit, labeled, with what I would later learn was the closest thing a Vrocash targeting computer has to confusion. Unknown. Survivability, 0%. Status, active. I pulled the feed tighter, ran the magnification as high as the optics would allow without losing the lock, and watched the shape resolve into something with 2 legs and 2 arms and no visible equipment that should have let it survive even a tenth of what the storm was doing to the water around it. It was not fleeing. It was not sheltering. It was moving along the edge of a structure that the sensors had already marked as compromised, doing something with its hands that I had no frame of reference for at all. I sat very still for a moment, looking at that single moving shape inside a storm that should have already killed it, and felt the first small crack open in everything I thought I understood about what a boring planet was supposed to look like. Vask, I said, you should see this. He came to look. He did not say anything for a long time, neither did I. Behind us, the system kept running its survivability number, over and over, refusing to update it no matter how long the shape stayed alive, as if even the machine had decided the number could not possibly be right, and was simply waiting for the world to correct itself. Neither did I. I logged the coordinates, locked the feed, and began the long, careful work of turning a single impossible shape in a storm into a full surveillance pattern. Because that was the job, and because some part of me, the part that still remembered the exact weight of a vent crawler's shadow passing over a scaffold, already wanted to know more about a species that walked into the kind of weather my own world would have made a holiday out of avoiding. We ran 19 drones over Earth across the next 8 days, each one disguised as drifting debris or migrating weather balloons or simple atmospheric static, low enough to listen, high enough that nothing on the surface ever looked up and saw us for what we were. Passive surveillance is the dullest assignment in the fleet right up until it isn't, and for the first 6 hours I genuinely believed this one was going to stay dull. Children moving in groups through structures the database called schools, adults moving in slower groups through structures it called offices, vehicles in long, patient lines, going nowhere fast, which Oren found endlessly funny. They built machines that move faster than anything on Sankara, he said, watching a feed of a packed roadway crawling along at a pace I could have outrun on foot. And then they all agree to use them at the exact same time, every single day, so none of them work. Maybe it's a ritual, Cam offered, not looking up from her own console. Maybe sitting still in a metal box is how they grieve. Grieve what? Their schedule. That was the tone for most of the first day. Strange, yes. New, yes. But not dangerous, not really. Not in any way that explained 3 long-range arrays going off at once. I almost let myself relax into it. Then the drone over the eastern coastline pulled in a feed from what the database called a county fair, and I watched a small human, no taller than my own knee, walk up to a stand selling something called the Inferno Challenge and eat it. I pulled the chemical readout before I even processed what I was watching, because that is the training. You assess the substance before you assess the behavior, and the readout came back with a compound concentration that on Sankara would have triggered an evacuation order. Capsaicin, the file said calmly, like that was a reasonable word for a substance that registered on our scale somewhere between irritant gas and outright toxin. The child's face went red. Tears streamed down both sides of it. A larger human standing nearby, the database tagged her as Grace Sutton, recorded from an earlier pass through the same town. A coastal rescue volunteer with sun-bleached hair and a voice that carried, was laughing so hard she had to lean on the stand for balance. "Worth it?" she called out. The child gave a small, fierce nod, wiped both eyes with the back of one hand, and asked for a second one. Oren made a sound I can only describe as delighted horror. That is a child. That is a child voluntarily consuming a chemical agent for entertainment, and the adult in charge of it is encouraging the behavior. "Tag it," Vask said, from the command chair, in the careful flat voice he used when he did not yet know how worried to be. "Log it under recreational tolerance. We'll need a baseline." I tagged it. I did not laugh. I kept thinking about the readout, the actual number, the line where our own field manuals would have called for full protective gear, and the fact that the human in question had asked for seconds. It did not stop there. Over the next 2 days the pattern repeated itself in a dozen different shapes, none of them coordinated, none of them performed for any audience that mattered, which was somehow worse, because it meant this was not a display. This was simply how the species spent its free time. A human climbed a sheer rock face with no rope, no harness, nothing but bare hands and chalk dust, 300 meters above a field of stone that would have ended him instantly on contact. And our drone clocked his heart rate at a level that would have meant a medical emergency on my own ship, and he was smiling the entire way up. A group of younger humans ran directly at each other at speed, wearing padding that our analysis flagged as cosmetic at best, and collided on purpose, repeatedly, for the apparent enjoyment of a crowd that screamed with pleasure every time one of them went down hard enough not to get up immediately. There was a long-distance race the same week, thousands of them moving together along a route that wound through one of their cities. And one runner near the back of the field, a woman named Sophie Lane, tore something in her leg at the halfway mark badly enough that our medical analysis flagged immediate cessation of activity as the only acceptable response. She did not stop. She walked the next stretch, then ran again, favoring the leg in a way that made every step look like an argument she was losing, and crossed the finish line 3 hours later to a crowd of strangers who had no idea what it had cost her, and cheered anyway, because in this species, apparently, that was simply what you did when you saw someone refuse to fall down. "By the 9th molt," I said, the first time I watched that particular collision happen, and meant it. There was a man in one of their cities who spent his working days suspended from a single cable outside the upper floors of a glass tower, cleaning windows hundreds of meters above a street full of vehicles that would have ended him instantly on impact, and our drone clocked him taking a meal break out there, swinging gently in the wind, eating from a small container balanced on one knee like the drop beneath him was simply part of the view. When a gust caught his platform hard enough to spin it a quarter turn, he did not so much as raise his voice. He waited, unhurried, for it to settle, and finished his meal. "You say that like it's new information," Cam said. "Wait until you see the one with the bulls." I saw the one with the bulls. I am not going to describe the one with the bulls. I will say only that an entire town turns out for it every year, on purpose, and that nobody made them. There was also a man named Noah Pratt, tagged by our drones 3 separate times in the space of a week, who drove a battered vehicle directly toward weather systems the rest of his species was actively fleeing. The first time, I assumed it was an error in the tracking. 2 signals crossing paths by accident. The second time, I pulled his transmission feed, a low-power radio broadcast he was sending out to anyone listening, narrating wind speeds and cloud formations in a voice so calm it sounded rehearsed, while his own vehicle's sensors, cruder than ours but accurate enough, showed him driving directly underneath a rotating funnel of air that our threat board rated as an immediate lethal hazard. "He's getting paid for this," Oren said, checking the secondary feed, the one tracking financial transactions tied to the broadcast. "People watch him do this, on purpose. They pay to watch." "Define paid," Cam said. "Define purpose," I said, and neither of them had an answer, and the funnel passed close enough to lift his vehicle's rear wheels off the ground for 2 full seconds before setting it back down, and Noah Pratt laughed into his microphone, breathless, delighted, and said something about getting an even better angle on the next one. The thing that finally cracked something open in me, more than the spice, or the cliffs, or the deliberate collisions, or a man who chased the weather for a living, was smaller than all of it, a structure fire, mid-sized, in a residential block on the same coastline our drones had already mapped twice. The automated emergency response arrived within minutes, which was expected, which fit the data we already had on the species' civil infrastructure. What was not in the data, what no file had prepared me for, was the man who arrived before them. He came out of the house 2 doors down at a dead run, in bare feet, wearing what the database would later tag as sleepwear, and went straight through the open front door of a burning structure, while every other visible human on the street was moving the opposite direction. No equipment. No training markers in his file, beyond a coastal rescue rating he held in connection with a volunteer post down by the water. The same role, the same easy authority in his stride, that we had already flagged once before, around the same stretch of coast. The same man the system had tagged Daniel Ashcroft after his first pass through our footage 3 days earlier, hauling a swamped boat back to a dock in weather that should have kept anyone with sense indoors. I watched the thermal signature of the fire climb past the point where our own field manuals listed survival as theoretical, and I watched him go in anyway. He came back out 40 seconds later, half carrying, half dragging an elderly human woman wrapped in what looked like a bedsheet, both of them coughing, both of them alive, and he sat her down on the curb, checked her over with his hands the way you'd check over a piece of equipment you trusted to still be working, and then, and this is the part that stayed with me longest, the part I replayed more times than I am willing to admit, he laughed. Not the laughter of relief, not exactly. Something dry and worn in, the kind of laugh that had clearly been used for worse moments than this one. "Forgot my shoes again," he said to her, loud enough for the drone's audio pickup to catch it clean. "Grace is never going to let me hear the end of this." The old woman, still coughing, still wrapped in a sheet that had nearly caught fire along with the rest of her house, laughed too. Nobody screamed the way prey is supposed to scream. That was the detail I kept returning to, alone in my bunk during the hours I should have been resting. On every world I had ever surveyed, danger produced a recognizable shape of fear, a universal grammar of self-preservation that you could read across 100 different species without needing a translator. Earth had that grammar too, somewhere. I had seen flickers of it, a flinch, a held breath, but it kept getting interrupted by something else entirely. A joke, a second helping. A man running toward fire in his bare feet because the alternative, apparently, had simply not occurred to him as an option worth considering. "You're quiet," Oren said, on the 4th evening, finding me still at the surveillance station long after my shift had technically ended. "I'm thinking. About the bulls. About the man who went into the fire." Oren glanced at the frozen frame still up on my console, the curb, the sheet, the 2 of them laughing at something that should have ended both their lives an hour earlier. "He got lucky. He didn't check first," I said. "He didn't run a threat assessment. He didn't wait for backup. He heard a sound and he went. So he's reckless. Maybe." I did not believe it, even as I said it. And some part of me already knew I didn't. The same way you know a structure is about to give before it actually does. Or maybe that's just what their baseline looks like, and we've spent 8 days mistaking a normal Tuesday for 100 separate emergencies. That's not a comforting thought. It wasn't meant to be. He sat down beside me, uninvited, the way he always did, and watched the frozen frame for a while without saying anything else. On Sankara, comfort that costs nothing is usually worth exactly that, but Oren had a habit of sitting with a problem instead of solving it, which I had learned, slowly, over 4 years of serving beside him, was its own kind of help. "You ever notice," he said eventually, "that every single one of them, the spice, the cliffs, the fire, none of it ever looks like a performance for us. They're not doing it because anyone's watching. I noticed. That's the part that bothers you. That's the part that bothers me. Oren did not have an answer for that. Neither, by the 9th day, did Vask, when the report came due and he stood in front of the command display scrolling through 8 days of footage that should never have come out of a Class 9 backwater survey. His jaw set in the particular way that meant he was already rewriting how the next phase of the mission would go. It went sideways before any of us were ready for it. One of the drones, the one holding station above the same coastline that kept appearing in feed after feed, took a strike from wind shear inside a storm system that had not been on any forecast model we'd pulled, ours or theirs, and went down hard, trailing smoke, somewhere along a stretch of open water just off the coast we had already started, without quite admitting it to ourselves, to think of as familiar. "Status," Vask said, already moving toward the command chair. "Partial," Cam answered, fingers moving fast across her console. "Core's intact. It's transmitting a locator beacon on a low band. Should be below anything their own equipment can pick up, but it's down inside the storm radius, and the storm is not slowing down. Recovery window? Closing. Fast. 18 hours, maybe less, before tidal movement either buries it or drags it somewhere a fishing vessel finds it first. And if a fishing vessel finds it first? Nobody answered that one, because nobody needed to. 8 days of footage had already taught us exactly how a Vrokash surveillance corps, full of recorded faces and tagged names and a record of every coastline we'd quietly catalogued, would look to a species that ran toward fire instead of away from it. Curious was not a comforting word, applied to people like that. Vask looked at the storm pattern on the main display, the same churning shape that had first shown us a single impossible human walking into weather that should have killed him, and then he looked at me, because he already knew, the way Vask always seemed to know things half a second before he said them out loud, exactly who he was about to send down into it. "Cawthorne, get your squad ready." We dropped through the storm wall 11 minutes later, 4 of us in a stealth pod no larger than a transport crate, and I want to be clear about something before I describe what happened next. I had survived Sankara. I had been 300 meters up a scaffold with a vent crawler's mandibles closing on empty air where my hand had been a second earlier. I had ranked Deathworlder on a planet built to kill its own children before they finished growing into adults. None of that prepared me for what Earth's weather did to a stealth pod at low altitude. The wind did not blow in one direction. It changed its mind every few seconds, slamming the pod sideways, then up, then down hard enough that Oren's restraint harness cracked against his shoulder, and he swore in 3 different dialects at once. Rain hit the hull like gravel. Somewhere below us, lightning split the sky in a pattern our sensors could not predict fast enough to route around, and Cam, white-knuckled at the secondary controls, said the thing none of us wanted to hear out loud. "This isn't survivable for a craft this size. We need to set down." "Set down where?" Oren shouted. "There's a structure under us, some kind of dock. It's already half submerged. Anywhere flat that isn't open water." We did not find anywhere flat. We found a long wooden pier, half collapsed already, jutting out into water that had risen far past where it was ever meant to reach, and the pod's landing struts caught the edge of it at an angle that threw all 4 of us against our harnesses at once. The hull held, the pier did not. I heard the structure give way beneath us in a long, groaning crack, wood and metal twisting apart, and the pod tipped, slid, and came to rest wedged between 2 collapsed support beams with the storm still screaming overhead, and black water rising fast around the wreckage. "Report," I said, forcing my voice level, because somebody had to. "Cam's pinned," Oren said. "Beams across her leg. I can't shift it alone." "I'm fine," Cam said, in a voice that made it clear she was not fine. "Get the core. The mission doesn't stop because the doc decided to disagree with us. It should have been simple. Locate the surveillance core, sealed and floating somewhere in the wreckage. Pull it before the rising water carried it out into open ocean. Get back to the pod. Get airborne the moment there was a break in the wind shear long enough to risk it. I had run harder extractions than this with less equipment and worse odds. But the water kept rising, faster than any model had predicted, and the beam across Cam's leg would not move, and somewhere in the dark beyond the wreckage I heard a sound that did not belong to the storm at all. A human voice, shouting, against the wind, in a language our translators caught half a beat late. "Is someone out there? I see a light. Hold on, I'm coming." I froze. 4 years of training screamed at me to go dark, kill every light source, vanish into the storm the way we were built to. No contact, no footprint. The same rule that had governed every single hour of surveillance up to this point. But Cam's leg was pinned under a beam that outweighed her, and the water was climbing past the wreckage with every passing second, and somewhere underneath all of that training was a colder calculation, the kind every Deathworlder learns to make without flinching. Dead is worse than discovered. Stay down, I told Oren. Whoever that is, let them think we're storm victims. Cover what you can. There was no time to do much else. A shape came through the rain and the dark, moving fast and low across the broken pier with a confidence that should not have been possible on wood that was actively coming apart underfoot. A coil of rope over one shoulder. A small handheld light clipped to a vest soaked through and useless against the downpour. He dropped to one knee beside the wreckage without a single second of hesitation, and the light swept across us. Across Cam pinned under the beam. Across Oren's face. Across mine. And I watched something pass through his expression that was not the scream of recognition I had spent 4 years assuming any first contact would produce. It was confusion, then concern, then, almost immediately, a decision. Okay, he said, mostly to himself, the way a person talks when they are organizing a problem out loud. Okay, that's a lot to take in, and I am absolutely going to need someone to explain it to me later. But right now you've got someone pinned, and the water's not waiting for either of us to process this. So, later. Explain later. You can understand me, I said, before I could stop myself, because our translators were running, and his voice in my ear sounded like Vrokash, the same way mine apparently sounded like his language in his. I can understand you fine, he said, already moving, already getting his shoulder under the edge of the beam, pinning Cam's leg, testing its weight. I'm Daniel, by the way, Coastal Rescue. This is going to sound strange, but I need you to trust me for about 30 seconds, because I've done this part before, just not for, He glanced at me again, quick, unbothered in a way that did not match anything in our behavioral models. Not for whoever you are. Okay, on 3, I need you pulling her out, not me lifting alone. The beam's rotten through the middle. It'll give if I push the wrong way and crush her worse. Got it? I did not have time to decide whether to trust him. I had time to act, and acting was the only thing 4 years of Deathworlder training had ever actually prepared me for, so I moved into position beside Cam, hands under her shoulders, and Daniel set his weight against the beam at an angle that made no sense to me, until I watched it work, distributing the load sideways instead of straight up, using the broken pier itself as a lever against its own collapse. 3, he said. 2. No pause for 1. He drove his shoulder into the beam and I pulled, and Cam came free with a sound that made Oren flinch, the beam crashing down a half-second later into the space where her leg had been, and the whole structure shuddered under all of us at once, a long warning groan that meant the rest of it was coming down too, and soon. Move, move, off the pier, now. We moved. Daniel went last, which I noticed even through the chaos of it, even through the rain and the screaming wind, and Cam's weight half carried between Oren and me, because the part of my training that never fully switches off was already cataloging the order in which everyone left a collapsing structure, and on Sankara, the last one out is either the strongest, or the one nobody planned on saving. He did not look like either of those things. He looked like a man doing a job he had done 100 times before, just not for anyone shaped quite like us. The pier finished collapsing 11 seconds after the last of us cleared it, the whole structure folding into the black water with a sound like something enormous exhaling, and for a moment none of us said anything at all. 4 Vrokash and 1 soaked, breathless human standing on a strip of half-flooded shoreline, while the storm kept hammering down around all of us like it had not noticed the rescue had already happened. Daniel looked at Cam's leg, already swelling under the wet fabric of her suit, then at me, then at the wreckage of our pod still wedged against the broken support beams a few meters out, half submerged now and sinking fast. That yours? He asked. Yes. It going to explode or anything? Asking for practical reasons? No. Good. Then let's get her somewhere dry before we worry about the rest of it. He shifted his grip on Cam without waiting for permission, settling her weight more securely against his side, and started moving up the shoreline toward a low structure half hidden behind the tree line, lights burning warm and steady in 2 of its windows despite everything the storm was throwing at it. You can tell me what you are later. Right now I just need to know if she's allergic to anything. Because my first aid kit's good, but it's not exactly built for extraterrestrials. I did not have an answer for that. I did not, in that moment, have an answer for very much at all. I followed him up the shoreline through rain that should have driven any sensible creature underground, watching a single unarmed human carry one of my own crew like the weight of her meant nothing, like the impossibility of all 4 of us meant nothing, already deciding, before any of us had said a single word to explain ourselves, that the only thing that mattered right now was getting us somewhere dry. I had a word for that, once. I did not use it. I filed it away instead, the way I filed everything that cost too much to look at directly, and kept walking. The structure turned out to be a rescue station, low-roofed and salt-worn, lined with the kind of equipment that told you exactly what its owner did with most of his nights: coiled rope, flotation gear, a radio unit crackling with weather updates in a clipped, businesslike voice. Daniel set Cam down on a long bench and went to work on her leg with the same unhurried competence he had shown on the pier, cutting away the ruined fabric, checking the joint with careful hands, talking the entire time in a low, steady stream that I understood, slowly, was not nervousness. It was a method. He was narrating the danger out loud so it had somewhere to go that wasn't silence. Nothing's broken, I don't think, but it's swelling fast, so we're not putting weight on it tonight. He glanced up at me, then at Oren, who stood near the door with one hand resting on a sidearm he had not drawn, and clearly did not know whether he was allowed to. You can put that away. I'm not going to do anything with this leg except wrap it. Promise. Oren looked at me. I gave the smallest shake of my head, and he let his hand drop, slow and visible, the way you signal stand down to someone who has earned the right to see you do it. Cothern. Vask's voice cut through my comm, tight with a tension I rarely heard from him. Report, now. Squad's alive. Cam's injured, non-critical. We made contact. A pause that stretched a half-second too long. Define contact. A human pulled her out from under a collapsed structure before the water took her. We're sheltering in a coastal building, off the open shore. He hasn't raised any alarm. He's treating her injury right now. Cothern, you understand what command does with first contact protocol violations on a Class 9 world. There are procedures. There are people whose entire job is making sure incidents like this get cleaned up before they become incidents at all. I understand the procedure, sir. I kept my voice level, the way I had on the pier, because somebody had to. I'm telling you what's true instead. He had 30 seconds to decide what we were, and what to do about it, and he chose to save her life before he asked us a single question. I think that matters more than the procedure does right now. Another pause, longer this time. The core? I had not forgotten it. I had simply run out of room, for those few minutes, to think about anything beyond the beam and the water and Cam's leg, still in the wreckage. Submerged, drifting with the tide. I'll recover it before extraction. You have 4 hours before the storm window closes and the pickup ship has to abandon the approach. Do not let that core end up in a fishing net, Cothern. Whatever else happens tonight, that does not happen. He was right to worry. 8 days of footage stored in a surveillance core, faces and names and coastlines, sitting in open water off a coast that, I had already learned by then, belonged to people who ran toward the things that should have scared them away. I told Vask I understood, closed the channel, and turned to find Daniel already watching me, the wrapping on Cam's leg nearly finished, his expression unreadable in the low light of the station. You need to go back out there, he said. It was not a question. There's equipment in the wreckage. It needs to be recovered before the tide carries it out, or before someone finds it who isn't supposed to. Define someone who isn't supposed to. Anyone. He considered that for a moment, then reached for a second coil of rope hanging by the door, testing the knot at one end with 2 quick pulls. Then I'm coming with you. That water's still rising, and that shoreline's got a current that's pulled stronger swimmers than either of us under before. You don't know it. I do. This isn't your mission. No, he agreed. Easy, like the word cost him nothing at all. But it's my coastline, and you're carrying something through it that you clearly don't want lost. And I've got about 4 hours before the storm peaks and makes the whole question moot anyway. So we can argue about jurisdiction, or we can go find your equipment before the ocean decides the argument for both of us. Oren, behind me, made a small sound that might have been a laugh under different circumstances. I did not have a counter-argument ready, and the storm was not going to wait for me to construct one, so I went, and Daniel came with me, back out into wind that had not softened at all, down a shoreline lit only by his small handheld light and the distant flicker of lightning over open water. We found the core 40 minutes later, wedged between 2 submerged pilings near where the pier had finally given way completely. Its housing scratched but intact, the locator beacon still pulsing faint and steady under the surface. Getting to it meant wading into water that came up past my chest, current dragging sideways hard enough that I had to brace against a half-buried beam just to hold position. And it was Daniel, rope looped twice around his waist and anchored to a piling on shore, who went the final distance and pulled it free, holding it over his head one-handed against a current that was actively trying to take him with it. Got it, he called back, voice nearly lost under the wind, heavier than it looks. Don't drop it. Wasn't planning on it. He started back toward shore, slow, deliberate steps against a current that kept trying to argue with each one, and I watched him do it with the same flat, unhurried competence he had used on the pier, on Cam's leg, On every single moment since the light had first swept across our wreckage and found something his species had no name for. He did not look heroic. He looked like a man doing a difficult, ordinary job, the way I imagined he looked doing it on any other storm night of his life, for people who looked exactly like him. That was the part I could not file away cleanly, no matter how many times I tried over the following hours. Not the strength of it, not even the courage, the ordinariness. On Sankara, what he had just done, twice, in one night, without hesitation, without payment, for strangers he could not have begun to understand, would have earned a name carved into the molting wall, spoken aloud at ceremonies for years afterward, the kind of act a whole settlement built stories around. Here, it seemed to be simply Tuesday. I did not say any of that to him. I did not say much of anything. Walking back up the shoreline with the recovered core cold and dripping in my arms, the storm finally beginning, just barely, to loosen its grip on the night. Not safe. The drone came in low and silent 40 minutes later, while Daniel was still wringing storm water out of his shirt by the station door, and I felt it before I saw it, a faint pressure shift in the air that every Deathworlder learns to recognize the way prey learns the shadow of something circling overhead. Coalition containment units do not announce themselves. They are built for one purpose: scrubbing first contact incidents clean before they can spread, and they do not carry the kind of judgment that tells the difference between a willing rescuer and a witness who needs to be removed. I had seen one operate exactly once before, years earlier, on a training exercise meant to demonstrate exactly how fast and how quiet a cleanup protocol could move once it was triggered. It had taken less than 4 seconds, that day, to neutralize a simulated target standing in the open with no warning at all. I did the math without meaning to, the same automatic calculation that had once told me precisely how long I had before a vent crawler closed the last 10 meters between us, and the number it gave me for Daniel, standing exposed and soaked in the open doorway with no idea what was approaching, was somewhere closer to 2. Down. I had him by the shoulder and moving before the thought finished forming, shoving him sideways through the station door as the drone's targeting array lit up the wet ground where he had been standing a half-second earlier. Containment unit, it's not ours. It's reading him as an exposure risk. A what? There was no time to explain it properly. The drone fired a suppression charge meant to disable, not kill, the kind of round that drops a target without leaving a mark, and I put myself between it and Daniel because 4 years of training had taught my body to make that decision faster than my mind could argue with it. The charge caught me across the shoulder instead, a white, total kind of pain that dropped me to one knee, every nerve in my left arm going dark and useless all at once. Isek. Oren's voice, somewhere behind me, and then the sharp crack of his own sidearm, twice, and the drone spun off course, smoking, and clipped the edge of the station roof before it went down hard in the wet sand outside. For a moment, nobody moved. Rain hammered the roof above us, steady now instead of screaming. The worst of the storm finally passed. My arm hung wrong at my side, the same way my hand had hung wrong off that scaffold 3 days and one entire understanding of the universe ago, and Daniel was crouched beside me, before I had finished processing that the threat was actually gone. Cam, still pinned upright by her own wrapped leg, watched the whole exchange from the bench with an expression I had rarely seen on her in 4 years of serving together. You stepped in front of a containment round, she said. For him. It was protocol. It was not protocol, Cathern. Protocol is letting the unit do its job and filing the paperwork after. She did not say anything else about it, but she kept watching me a moment longer than she needed to, and I understood, without either of us saying so, that this was the kind of detail Cam cataloged the same way I did, quietly, to be examined again later when there was time to actually look at it. That thing was aiming at me, he said. It was not quite a question. Yes. Because I saw you. Yes. He absorbed that the way he seemed to absorb everything, quickly, without the kind of spiraling panic our behavioral models had spent 8 days insisting was the species' default response to danger. And you stepped in front of it. I did not have a good answer for that one. I am not certain I have one now. It's protocol, I said, which was true, and also not the reason. And some small, exhausted part of me suspected he already knew that. Sure it is. He did not push it further. He got an arm under me instead, careful of the shoulder, and half-carried, half-walked me back inside the station, settling me onto the same bench where Cam's leg still sat wrapped and elevated, her face pale but alert, watching the whole exchange with an expression I was too tired to read. Vask's voice came through my comm a moment later, clipped and furious. Cawthorne, report. We just lost telemetry on a containment unit in your sector. It's down. Oren disabled it. There was no clean extraction window, sir. It fired on the human. A long pause. Casualties? Mine, not his. I could hear, even through the comm, the precise sound of Vask deciding not to ask the follow-up question that would have made him responsible for the answer. Pick up ships holding at the edge of the storm radius. You have 90 minutes before the window closes for good, and we're stuck explaining to command why an entire squad is still sitting on a Class 9 surface. Get that shoulder stabilized and get back to the extraction point. Understood. He closed the channel. Daniel was already pulling supplies from a cabinet behind the bench, the same unhurried economy of motion he'd used on Cam's leg, on the rope around his waist in the water, on every single thing he had done since the moment his light first found us in the wreckage. You didn't have to step in front of that thing, he said, not looking up from the supplies, his voice carefully, even in a way that told me the question underneath it mattered to him more than the tone let on. Whatever it was, you didn't know me an hour ago. It was reading you as a threat to be removed. I had information you didn't. That's not an answer to what I asked. I did not have a better one ready, and the silence stretched a beat too long before I filled it with something closer to honest than I had intended. On my world, you do not let something die in front of you that you had the ability to stop, regardless of how long you've known it. The calculation isn't about time. It's about whether you could have acted and chose not to. I could have acted. He considered that, setting a tray of supplies down on the bench beside me. That's a hard way to live. It's the only way I know how to. Yeah, he said, quieter now, something in his face shifting the way mine apparently had earlier, though I had no language yet to read what his particular shift meant. I think I might know a little something about that too. This is going to hurt, he said, cutting away the ruined fabric at my shoulder to get a clear look at the burn underneath. I don't actually know what your pain tolerance looks like, so I'm just going to assume it's bad and go slow. It's already bad. Comforting. He cleaned the wound with quick, sure hands, and kept talking the whole time, low and steady, the same method he'd used to give the danger somewhere to go. Storm's supposed to clear out by morning. Wind's already dropping. Probably going to spend tomorrow hauling debris off this stretch of beach instead of sleeping, which is the usual trade after a night like this. A pause, brief, while he checked the wrap against my shoulder for fit. Had a dog who hated storms. Old guy, mostly deaf by the end, but he could feel a front coming in from 2 days out. Used to park himself under the kitchen table and refused to move for anything. Buster. Died last spring. 16 years old, which for his kind is basically ancient, and I still catch myself listening for him whenever a storm like this rolls in, like he's going to come find me under some table somewhere. He tied off the wrap, sat back, and looked at me properly for the first time since we'd come inside. Sorry. You don't need to hear about my dog. Nerves talk. I don't mind. He studied me for a moment. The way you study a reading on an instrument you don't fully trust yet. You don't seem like someone who admits that easily. He was not wrong. I felt something move underneath the pain in my shoulder, something older and far less stable. And I reached, automatically, for the tool I had always reached for, the familiar heat of anger rising up sweet and known, the same anger that had carried me off a vent crawler's scaffold and through 3 molting trials and out the other side of every moment that should have broken me cleaner than it did. It rose. It steadied. And then, for the first time in longer than I could remember, it did not hold. What came up instead was smaller and much older, a fragment with no proper shape to it, a memory of cold instruments and a name I do not say out loud anymore, a version of myself who had also once sat very still while careful hands worked on a wound she had not chosen, listening to a calm voice explain that this part too was simply what survival cost. I did not say any of that to Daniel. I did not have the words for it even in my own language, let alone his. But something in my face must have shifted, because he did not ask. He simply stopped talking, let the silence sit there between us instead of filling it, and kept his hands steady on the last of the wrap, the way you stay still around something that might bolt if you move too fast. 90 minutes, I said finally, my voice rougher than I wanted it to be. Then we've got time to get you both back to the water before your ride decides to leave without you. He stood, offered Cam a hand she did not quite need but accepted anyway, and glanced back at me once more before opening the station door to the last thin edge of the storm. For what it's worth, he said, whatever just happened on your face a second ago, you don't have to explain it. I'm not going to pretend I understood half of tonight. But I know what it looks like when somebody's carrying something they didn't get to put down properly. Doesn't take a translator for that. I did not answer him. I was not certain, in that moment, that I trusted my own voice to do it without giving away more than I had already given. I gathered Cam's other side instead, and Oren took point at the door, and the 4 of us moved out into the thinning rain toward the extraction point, the recovered core cold against my ribs where I'd strapped it under my good arm, the rupture he had noticed and not pressed left exactly where it was. We were 300 meters out when headlights swept across the tree line ahead of us, slow and searching, and Daniel went rigid beside me, one hand coming up flat in a gesture I understood instantly, without needing a translator at all. Stop, stay still. Grace, he said low, checking on the station, probably, after a storm like that. She does this every time. He looked at the four of us, soaked and strange and entirely unexplainable by any account he could possibly give her, and made a decision so fast I almost missed him making it at all. Get behind the dune line, I'll head her off. Daniel, you've got maybe 90 seconds before that ship of yours leaves without you. I don't have a plan beyond stalling, but I'm good at stalling. Go. We went. I pulled Cam down behind the rise of sand with Oren covering the other side, and through the gap in the grass I watched Daniel walk out toward the approaching headlights with his hands loose at his sides and his voice already pitched into something easy and unbothered, the same tone he'd used narrating the danger to himself on the pier, except now it was aimed outward, a performance built to make an entire conversation look smaller than it was. Hey, you didn't have to drive all the way out here, he called as the vehicle slowed. I was just about to call it a night myself. A woman's voice answered, warm, familiar, carrying easily over the last of the wind. Saw the station lights still on past midnight, and figured you'd either fallen asleep on the radio again, or you'd found something interesting to do with your evening. Which is it? Storm damage, he said, without missing a beat. Pier's gone, half the equipment shed flooded. I'll have a full report for you tomorrow once I've actually slept. You should head home, Grace. This can wait till morning. There was a pause just long enough that I felt Oren tense beside me, and then a short, easy laugh. Fine, but you look like something the tide dragged in, Daniel, so don't argue with me about getting some sleep either. The vehicle's engine shifted, headlights swinging away from the dune line, and a moment later, the sound of it faded back down the coast road, gone. Daniel exhaled, long and slow, and turned back toward the dunes. Okay, you're clear. Go, before I have to explain a second visit. I did not have time to thank him properly, and some part of me suspected he would have waved it off if I had tried. I gathered Cam's other side again, and the four of us moved the rest of the way to the extraction point in silence, the pickup ship's hatch already cycling open against the last of the rain, and the recovered core cold against my ribs where I'd strapped it under my good arm. The rupture he had noticed, and not pressed, left exactly where it was. Open, unfinished, mine to carry, the rest of the way back to the ship, alone. The wipe team was already waiting in the launch bay when our pod cleared the storm radius, 4 of them in clean, unmarked containment gear. The kind command sends down to handle witnesses the same way you'd send a cleaning crew to handle a spill. Vask met us at the hatch himself, which told me before he said a single word how seriously command had taken the night's events, because Vask did not meet pods at the hatch unless something above his rank was already watching. Status, he said, eyes moving over Cam's leg, my shoulder, the core clutched under my arm, cataloging damage the way I had been trained to catalog it myself. Core secure. Cam needs medical. I need medical. I kept my voice even, the same flat tone I had used reporting a vent crawler nearly taking my hand, because Vask responded better to facts laid out plainly than to anything dressed up as urgency. The human is uninjured. He saved Cam's life, then mine, then covered our extraction from a second human who nearly found us at the pickup point. He has had 4 direct exposures to this crew in under 3 hours, sir, and he has not panicked once. Which is exactly why the wipe team is standing right there, Vask said, quiet enough that the team in question couldn't hear it over the bay's ambient noise. 4 exposures is 4 exposures, Kythern, regardless of how calm he was through any of them. Command's protocol on witness contamination doesn't have an exception clause for good behavior. Then Command's protocol was written for a different kind of witness. He looked at me properly then, the way he had looked at the storm pattern 8 days earlier, recalculating something in real time. Explain that. I had 90 seconds, maybe less, before the wipe team finished their pre-deployment checks, and someone with more authority than either of us decided the conversation was already over. I used every one of them. We cataloged this species for 8 days expecting to find what every Class 9 survey finds, a population that responds to danger the way danger is supposed to be responded to, with fear, with avoidance, with the kind of self-preservation that makes memory suppression simple, because the witness wants to forget as much as we want them to. That is not what we found. We found a species that runs toward fire, that eats poison for entertainment, that chases storms for a living and laughs about it afterward. A species whose baseline tolerance for catastrophic risk would qualify, by our own coalition threat assessment standard, as Deathworld adjacent, not because their planet is trying to kill them, but because they have built an entire culture out of treating danger as something you walk into instead of away from. Kythern. If you wipe him, sir, and he notices the gap, and I believe he will notice, because everything we observed tonight says this is not a species that lets a missing piece of itself go unexamined, you will not have erased a witness. You will have created one who knows exactly what was taken from him, and has every reason in the world to go looking for the rest. We are not dealing with prey that forgets. We are dealing with something closer to what we are. The bay went quiet around us in the particular way that meant several people who were technically not part of the conversation had stopped pretending not to listen to it. Vask held my gaze for a long moment, and I watched him do the thing I had seen him do exactly twice before, in 4 years of service, weighing a regulation against the actual evidence sitting in front of him, and finding the regulation wanting. You're recommending we reclassify the species before we've even completed the survey, he said. I'm recommending we treat tonight's data as exactly what it is. A species this resistant to the fear response that contact protocol was built around does not behave the way the protocol assumes. Standard witness suppression was designed for populations that startle, that flee, that forget, because forgetting is easier than carrying the memory. This one carries everything. He carried 2 of my crew tonight without being asked, and he is going to carry this whether we wipe it or not. The only question is whether we leave him carrying a truth or a hole he'll spend the rest of his life trying to fill back in. That's not a tactical argument, Cawthorne. His voice had gone quieter, which from Vask meant he was no longer entirely disagreeing with me. That's a moral one. Be honest with yourself about which one you're actually making. He was right, and I let the silence sit there long enough that he knew I knew it. Because Vask had also earned his Deathworlder rank the hard way, and there is a particular kind of respect owed between people who have both bled for the same title, even when one of them is about to overrule the other's mission protocol. Both, I said finally. I'm making both arguments, sir, because I believe both of them are true, and because I watched that man put himself between my crew and a collapsing structure before he had a single reason to believe we were worth saving. I don't think Command's protocol was built to handle a species like that. I think it needs updating before it does any more damage than it's already capable of doing. Vask was quiet for a long moment, watching the wipe team finish their checks across the bay. 4 containment specialists with no context for any of what had just been argued in front of them. Then he turned, walked the short distance to their lead, and said something too low for me to hear, and I watched the team's posture shift, slow and visible, from active deployment to stand down, equipment lowering, the particular loose-shouldered relief of a job that has just been called off before it started. You've got until the formal survey report is filed to make your case to people with a great deal more authority than I have, Vask said, coming back to where I stood. I'm holding the wipe order, not canceling it. That's the best I can give you tonight, Cawthorne, and you should understand exactly how much I'm spending on your behalf by giving you even that much. I understand. Do you? It was not really a question. He studied me for a moment, the same way Cam had studied me in the rescue station, the way you study a piece of equipment whose readings have started behaving strangely. You put yourself in front of a containment round for a Class 9 native tonight, Isaac. I read the telemetry. That's not protocol. That's not tactical reasoning either, whatever you just told me in front of half the launch bay. He let that sit for a moment, not unkindly. Go get your shoulder looked at, write your report. We'll talk about the rest of it when there isn't an active deployment hanging over both our heads. I went. The medical bay worked on my shoulder in efficient, impersonal silence, nothing like the slow, narrating care Daniel had used on the same arm hours earlier. And somewhere in the gap between the 2 kinds of treatment I understood, fully and for the first time, exactly how much that difference had cost me to notice at all. Oren found me there an hour later, leaning in the doorway with his usual lack of invitation, watching the bone setter finish its work on my shoulder, the same patient way the medical bay had finished my thumb a lifetime ago, 3 days and 1 entire planet earlier. You argued a wipe team into standing down, he said. I argued Vask into delaying a wipe order. There's a difference. Vask doesn't delay things for people he isn't already half convinced about. He folded his arms, studying the readout above my bed without much interest in the numbers themselves. You going to tell me what actually happened down there, or am I going to keep hearing it secondhand from Cam for the next month? I told you what happened. Storm, extraction, contact. You told me the report version. He waited. The particular patient silence he used when he already suspected the answer mattered more than I was willing to admit out loud, and when I did not fill it, he let it go. The same way he had let the frozen frame of the burning house go on the 4th night of surveillance, sitting with the problem instead of solving it. For what it's worth, he said eventually. Cam thinks you did the right thing. I think you did the right thing. Neither of us is going to pretend we understand why it mattered to you this much. But we're not arguing with the outcome. That's not nothing. No, he agreed. It isn't. He pushed off the doorway, already turning to go, then paused. By the 9th multisec, you stepped in front of a containment round for a stranger you'd known less than an hour. I've served beside you 4 years, and I've never once seen you do that for one of us. I did not have an answer for that either. He did not seem to expect one. He left me there with the bone setter still working and the readout climbing slowly back toward green, and I spent a long time after that simply staring at the ceiling of the medical bay, turning his observation over the way I turned everything over that I did not yet know how to file. I spent the better part of 2 days writing the report. Command wanted threat assessments, population data, technological benchmarks, the standard architecture of a Class 9 survey file, and I gave them all of it, every number precise, every observation properly cited against 8 days of footage. But I built the actual argument around a single reframed designation, buried in the section Command always reads first, because it determines how much budget the rest of the file is worth defending, not primitive world, low containment priority, but emergent high-tolerance population. Its contact protocol requires revision pending further study. I cited the storm, I cited the spice the child ate twice, I cited Noah Pratt's broadcast and Sophie Lane's torn leg, and the man who ran into a burning house in his bare feet, because the alternative had simply not occurred to him. I pulled precedent too, the handful of times in coalition history that a newly cataloged species had been reclassified upward after first contact instead of downward, and there were not many of them to choose from. Most survey files run the other direction, a species looking more fragile the longer you study it, more easily startled, more easily managed. I found exactly 3 cases in the archive where the opposite had happened. 3 species whose initial threat rating had to be revised after contact revealed a tolerance for risk the original survey had badly underestimated, and in every one of those cases, the revision had come too late to prevent a containment incident that cost lives on both sides. I attached all 3 case files to my recommendation, not because I expected them to change anyone's mind on their own, but because I wanted the record to show, clearly and permanently, that I had not pulled this argument out of nowhere. I wanted it to show that I had done the work. I did not cite Daniel by name more than the file legally required. I gave Command exactly the data they needed to understand what they were dealing with, and nothing more than that about the specific man who had taught me what the data actually meant. The report went up the chain 3 weeks later, past VASC, past the survey division, into the kind of review committee that takes longer to read a single recommendation than most species take to live an entire life. I do not know yet whether it will change anything beyond delaying one wipe order on one stretch of one ordinary coastline. Command moves slowly, and protocols built over centuries do not bend easily for the testimony of a single Deathworlder squad that got lucky during one bad storm. But the wipe order is still on hold. Daniel is still, as far as our last passive sweep confirmed, exactly who he was the night I met him, narrating his own fear out loud to a stranger who had no business surviving the conversation, let alone the storm around it. I keep the file open on my private terminal some nights, the way you keep a wound open instead of letting it close wrong. Not the official version, the clean one Command will eventually approve or reject. The other one, the frame of him on the curb outside a burning house, sitting beside a woman wrapped in a sheet, laughing about forgotten shoes like the building behind them had not nearly taken them both. The recording of his voice, low and steady, explaining a dog named Buster who used to hide under a kitchen table whenever a storm rolled in, who has been gone since spring, who Daniel still listens for anyway, out of habit, out of something that was never going to make tactical sense and that I no longer believe needed to. Our last passive sweep of his coastline came back 2 days ago. The pier is already being rebuilt, slower than I expected, faster than it has any right to be. He was out there with a small crew of other coastal volunteers, Grace Sutton among them, hauling fresh timber across the same stretch of shoreline that had nearly killed all 5 of us in a single night, and at one point, for no reason the drone's sensors could account for, he stopped what he was doing, looked out at the water for a long moment, and said something too quiet for the pickup to catch clean. I have run that fragment of audio 11 times since. I still cannot tell whether he was talking to the storm, or to the dog, or to something else entirely that I have no business guessing at from this far away. Tonight, off duty, alone in my bunk, I held my right hand up to the light the way I do sometimes, turning it slowly, watching the gap where the smallest finger should be, catch the light, and lose it again. 3 molting trials, 3 years, a name I still do not say out loud. I used to think that gap was the whole of what survival cost, the entire ledger, paid in full and closed. I do not think that anymore. I think survival costs something every single time you let yourself notice it happening, in someone else, in a stranger who runs toward fire because the alternative never occurred to him, in the particular quiet of a man choosing to keep a missing dog's habits alive in his own, instead of letting them go. I think the gap in my hand was only ever the first installment. By the 9th molt, I earned the right to call myself Deathworlder on Sankara, a planet built from the ground up to test exactly how much a person can survive before it breaks them clean through. I wore that rank for 4 years like it meant something settled, something finished, a question my own world had already asked and answered about who I was. Then I found a species that has never once needed a trial to prove the same thing, that simply gets up every ordinary morning and walks back out into a world that could kill it 12 different ways before lunch, and calls that Tuesday. I do not know yet what command will decide to do with Earth. I do not know what they will decide to do with Daniel, or with the report sitting unread in a queue somewhere above people who have never once felt a storm try to take a piece of them, the way I have, the way he has, the way an entire species apparently has and never thought to mention it. I know what I will do, if it comes to that. I have already decided. I am simply waiting, the way I waited on that scaffold above the lava field, for the moment the decision actually asks something of me. Somewhere down on that small, loud, reckless planet, a man is almost certainly still awake, listening for a dog that will never come find him under any table again, and not minding the waiting one bit. I understand that now. I did not, before Earth. I do.